All right. Sorry for the earlier lagging issue. So what I've decided to do is I decided to do a recording of the uh, session so that I give you a more proper, smooth flowing session, hopefully. Right. So anyway, let's begin again. Right. So today we are going to look at the macroeconomic stabilization policies for recession in Singapore's context. Okay, so to help us understand this, right, first let's frame the problem first. What exactly is a macro stabilization problem? What you see on the screen here, right, is this thing called the business cycle that goes into like a downswing and an upswing. Now, what you see here on the blue color line, right, that's your full employment level of national income, or what is called YF, right? So the national income of a country, which is determined by the intersection of AD and AS, right, can occur actually below full employment, at full employment, or even above full employment. Now, some of you in your schools may not have learned this model. You only learn the below and you only learn the model about below and at full employment, just to show you how it might look like, right? So if let's say I have a, oops, sorry, that looks ugly. If I have a AS curve. So this is the LRAS curve, the vertical portion of the AS curve. So, and then you have your SRAS. So when the two intersect, right, then you can actually have a national income that is actually above the full employment level as well. Okay, but in any case, right, so what's the goal of the government, right? The goal of the government here, right, is to create what we call a stable economic growth situation where you don't want to have too high. When it's too high, right, on this side of the business cycle, what you have is inflation. When your AD is too low, then what you have is called demand deficient unemployment. So the goal of the government, right, is to try to moderate the business cycle, right? Moderate the business cycle so that the business cycle is dampened, right? So when it's too high, we bring it down. When it's too low, we try to bring it up. Stylus, I need to change the stylus anyway. So it's not very helpful here. All right, never mind. So this is the goal of the government is to dampen the amplitude of the business cycle. So when AD is too high, we bring it down. When AD is too low, we bring it back up. Now, in a very standard economic recession, right? How does recession happen? A recession happens caused by some event that caused AD to fall. So maybe trading partner goes into a recession. They induce consumption decreases. They buy fewer goods and services, including imports. They buy less of our goods, and our exports fall, will cause our AD to fall. And this is how we can enter a recession. So one way a recession happens is a fall in AD. Well, there's another form of recession. Another form of recession is the fall in AS, right? So for instance, let's say global energy prices increase, for example. This could cause a increase in unit cost of production in your country. SRAS curve shifts up, and then through the wealth effect, interest effect, and trade effect, this could lead to the fall in national income, which is shown as a movement along the AD curve when the AS shifts up. All right, so this is how a recession happens. Now, how do we solve this? In a traditional Western country, way of looking at things, a very Keynesian idea, right? They see that in order for us to be at full employment, there must be a high enough level of total demand or aggregate demand in the economy. So if there's a fall in demand, there's too few people buying things, right? So then your economy surely falls short of full employment. So then the solution is to increase government spending, either by having expansionary fiscal policy where the government spends money, or using monetary policy where the government either uses interest rate or exchange rate, right, to entice the private sector to spend more, right? So in classical, or rather in standard fiscal policy, Keynesian fiscal policy, right, they simply use increased government spending to boost AD. Now, this is not so effective for Singapore, primarily because Singapore is a small multiplier. If you don't remember why, let's recap this, right? Singapore is small multiplier for two main reasons. Number one, we have a very high savings rate. The reason why we have a high savings rate in this country is because of the mandatory savings plan known as the CPF that requires people to save up to 37% of our monthly income in our government run CPF scheme. Now, on top of the monthly CPF savings, right, because I cannot access these CPF savings until I'm retired, most people want to put aside some cash, right, for emergency. So there's also private savings, right? So on top of the 37%, there's more private savings, right? So this will put Singapore's savings rate closer to around 50%, right? On top of that, in addition to the high MPS, right, marginal propensity to save, Singapore also has a very high MPM, or marginal propensity to import. This stems from the fact that Singapore has pretty much no natural resources. We have to import all the resources that we need to produce goods and services. And at the same time, we also have to import a lot of final consumer goods and services in this country, like our refrigerators, washing machines, and all this stems from the fact that we lack the CA, right, or comparative advantage in final goods and services. Now, for those of you who haven't learned about international trade, don't worry about this, right? Just take it that just argue that we have a high MPM because we are highly dependent on imports due to lack of resources. That will be good enough, right? So because of the small multiplier, fiscal policy doesn't work so well. So then, well, maybe you can try monetary policy. There are two forms of monetary policy. One form of monetary policy is called interest rate policy. Another form of monetary policy is known as exchange rate policy. Being a small and open economy, Singapore has chosen to manage our exchange rate. And based on the impossible trinity, right, we are not able to control the interest rate anymore. So Singapore does not have an independent interest rate policy. That we also say that Singapore is an interest rate taker. So what Singapore can do, right, is then to use our exchange rate policy to help us manage our economy. So how do we manage the economy in a downturn? Well, the simple way is to use depreciation of the Singapore dollar to make imports more expensive. When imports become more expensive, local households are likely to switch to locally produced goods, and this will cause AD to rise, right? So there will be a shift of AD curve to the right, and that will cause national income to increase. Of course, it will lead to some inflation on the right. Now, on the vertical axis, sorry. Now, at the same time, right, the stronger Sing dollar, right, is going to make imported inputs more expensive, and this leads to a rising unit cost of production that causes the SRAS curve to shift up. So you can see from the diagram, the SRAS curve shifts vertically up as a result of increased unit cost of production. Now, owing to the fact that Singapore has very little import substitutes to begin with, so when import prices become more expensive, local households switch to locally produced substitutes, right? There are not that many, so the ability to switch is somewhat muted. And at the same time, the high import content of Singapore's economy translates into the SRAS curve shift is really, really large, right? So if you recall, in class, we have gone through this data recently, this piece of information that Singapore's import content of exports is as high as 81%, meaning that on average, right, every dollar of exports that we earn, we actually direct 81 cents to that dollar to the we direct 81 cents to the dollar to imported inputs to produce such goods and services. So because of this, right, you look at the diagram now, you can see that the AD shift is of a certain magnitude. The AS shift, right, almost entirely offset the impact of the AD shift. So although there's still a net increase in RMY, as you can see from the diagram here, the net resultant effect is relatively small. But what's happening to the GPL is that you have a much greater increase in GPL. So overall, does this policy work? Is Singapore a country that is able to use exchange rate depreciation as our policy? Well, yes, we could, but this policy is unlikely to be very effective, and it has high harmful side effect. So because of this, right, Singapore needs to look for an alternative policy. So what's the alternative policy? Alternative policy is say, okay, we can't use demand side policy, right? Then let's use supply side policies. So what are supply side policies here? The supply side policy we're talking about is not your traditional long run supply side policy aimed at increasing productivity, increasing productive capacity. We're not talking about the kind of policy that tries to raise the gradient of the blue line, right, to get more potential growth, or to be able to shift the blue line higher, right? What we're trying to do, right, is to get the actual growth increase, right? So the increase in the supply side, here the supply side policy we're talking about are policies that will shift the SRAS curve downwards in a relatively short time. So the crux of this kind of policy is that it must have low time lags, right? So you can't be talking about maybe devoting resources to R&D or large-scale infrastructure development that takes years to complete. So we're talking about something that happens really, really quick. So how do you quickly lower labor unit cost of production in a country, right? Is you're going to find a way to lower labor costs, but it's not something you want to take years or even months to achieve. You want to do something that happens really, really quick to lower labor costs. This can come in the form of wage subsidies. We can also lower other type of business costs through utilities rebate as well as rental rebates. So this is the approach that Singapore uses. Now let's see how Singapore uses this as an actual policy. So if you look at the jobs support scheme in 2020, right, as well as the jobs credit scheme in 2009. This 2020 was the COVID recession. 2009 was the recession that came on the backs of the global financial crisis. So what the jobs credit support scheme did, right, was to initially give 8% subsidy to local employees' gross monthly wages of up to $3,600 per month to businesses, right, to help companies defray the labor costs. The goal is to help companies not have to lay off as many workers as they need to, try to retain as many workers as possible, right? And the time lag for this is exceptionally short, right? It was announced in February of 2020, but it was implemented retroactively, right? 5 months beforehand, right? So October, November, December, which is fourth quarter of 2019, the wages paid by companies in Singapore to local employees, meaning citizens and PRs, the firms could claim 8% of those wages paid, right, back from the government. Right, so up to the cap of $3,600 per month as their salary, right? So later on in March, right, 1 month later, we had a resilience budget where the government enhanced this job support scheme, right, and bumped it up to 25%, and in some industries was higher at 50%. And those industries that are highly affected by COVID, right, like air travel industry, for example, they were bumped up to 75% of the wages were paid for by the government, right? So this really helped companies keep workers on the job, even if there was not much work to do, right? So eventually the policy worked really well to help the economy, and by the second half of 2021, it was tapered down to a lower percentage, and eventually we moved it by 2022 March. All right, so this was the first time, not the first time, this was the most recent time we used this wage subsidy. The previous time we used the wage subsidy was the 2009 global financial crisis, where the Singapore government, right, used wage subsidy, this time in the form of a 12% wage subsidy to businesses up to a cap of $2,500 for the monthly salary. So these wage subsidies were announced in February of 2009, but retroactively implemented in January again, showing you that you actually can get these policies done really, really quickly, right? And the time lags are really short. So in both cases, right, the economy recovered. Like 2010, Singapore economy recovered very strongly, hitting like 14.5% real GDP growth. And in 2021, Singapore economy recovered with around 7.4% real GDP growth, if I'm not wrong about this, right? The important thing to note is that these policies are really, really expensive, right, to the government. Like, for example, the job support scheme cost the Singapore government 23.5 billion Singapore dollars in total, while the jobs credit scheme in 2009 cost $4.3 billion. So this is a really costly affair. Now, did the government always have the money to do this? Well, it turns out no, right? If you look at the first 3 recessions, right, that Singapore experienced in post-independence, just so you know, Singapore had 5 recessions. In 1985, we had a recession. In 1998, we had a recession. In 2002, 2003, we didn't have a recession per se. We had a technical recession over a couple of months. And then we had a global financial crisis 2009, recession, and COVID 2020. Now, in the first of the 3 recessions, post-independence recession, 85, 98, and 2002, 2003, the Singapore government was not necessarily in a most comfortable position to be able to give large amounts of wage subsidy. So in 1986, for example, right, instead of giving a wage subsidy, what the government did was to adjust the employer's contribution to workers' CPF down from 25%, right, to 10%. So there's a 15 percentage point drop in the employer's contribution to workers' CPF, which meant nearly 15%, 15 percentage point drop, 15% drop in wage rates, right? Or nearly, right? And then later on in 1998, due to the Asian financial crisis, the government did that again. This time was under the leadership of Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong, where he announced a 10% rate, CPF contribution rate cuts, which is tantamount to like nearly a 10% labor cost reduction. Then later in 2003, we had another technical recession due to a confluence of factors, the aftermath of the dot-com bust, followed by the 9/11 terrorist attack, and then later on we had SARS as well, right? So all this culminated in a slowdown in the economy that led to a technical recession in Singapore. So what the Singapore government had to do, right, was then again cut CPF contribution rates. This time only a small 3 percentage point decrease because the magnitude of the recession or technical recession wasn't particularly large. But nonetheless, in all 5 recessions, you can see, right, Singapore had used supply-side stabilisation policy known as cost-cutting measures. The first 3 of which did not involve as much of government expenses. There were some utilities rebates, there were some property tax rebates, but these were the minor components of the policy. The bulk of it was the CPF contribution rates cuts, which didn't cost the government money. Right? If you think about it, it actually saved the government money because the government also employed civil servants, right? And the government also had to pay CPF. And the fact the government is also paying less CPF to civil servants, that actually saved the government money. So only in 2009 and onwards, right, 2009 and 2020, did the government actually increase the government spending significantly through these supply-side policies. All right, so this is the Singapore's approach to dealing with short-run stabilization problems, which is a supply-side policy rather than your traditional demand-side policy as proposed by Keynes and a lot of Western economies, right? But what's going to come next, right, is really interesting. In Singapore, right, the government goes way beyond just stabilization, right? If you think about it, right, if there's an economic downturn and your demand for goods and services are low, your direct demand for labor is low, companies should lay off workers, right? But in order to protect workers from unemployment, the government has provided wage subsidies, right, to help workers to remain employed, right? And so they continue to have jobs, continue to have salaries, except that there's not a lot of things to do because there's not a lot of demand, and workers are being paid salaries to do pretty much maybe a fraction of the work that they used to do. So then the government thought, why not we take this opportunity when the workers are not having a lot to do anyway to send them for skills upgrading programs, right? So then the government went to the firms and say, hey, why don't you send your workers to some training? Then the companies will be like, hey, I'm not doing really well, right? The economy is doing really badly. Then the government say, well, we'll subsidize you, right? Up to 90%, right, of your training courses, right, can be subsidized during the 2009 this policy called SPUR, Skills Program for Upgrading and Resilience. So if you think about it, right, it makes perfect sense to train workers at this time, because in a normal situation when the economy is doing well, there's a lot of work to do, you have a labor shortage, every worker is needed to perform certain duties and work, right? And if you every time you take a worker out for training, right, there's opportunity cost, right? The worker's on course for 2 days, the worker is not producing stuff for 2 days, right? If worker went for a week's training, then it's a week of not doing work. So, but if it's an economic downturn, there's not much work to do, the opportunity cost would be at the lowest, right? So this will be the best time, except that it will cost a lot of money, right? It will cost a lot of money to send workers for training during this period. But if you had the money, it really makes sense. So in addition, right, to paying for like 90% of your skills training as a subsidy by the government, then your worker not showing up for work because they go for training, the government further subsidize them even, right? So there's even subsidy for absentee payroll as well. So overall, right, there was a huge amount of subsidies given by government, and the whole policy took about $600 to $700 million to implement. But this policy worked really, really well, right? Because if you look at the last word of SPUR, right, the last letter R here stands for resilience. It's talking about how the economy can bounce back during the economic recovery. And true enough, right, by 2010, when the global economy was recovering, the Asia-wide average, right, was roughly about 7.5% real GDP growth. Singapore was clocking 14.5% real GDP growth. We actually clocked the fastest real GDP growth rate in the world that year, right? And a big part of it, right, can be attributed to Spur actually taking advantage of the downtime, right, to actually upgrade our workers' skills so that when the global demand recovers by 2010, right, we are already no longer on the same level playing field as everybody else. We are already ahead because we took the time to upgrade our skills, right? So following that same playbook, right, in 2020 during COVID, in addition to paying a large sum of money for the job support scheme, the government also spends up to 7.4 billion compared to, you see, what was spent during the Spur 09 Spur, right, was 600, not even a billion, right? So in the 2020, this similar policy called SG United Jobs and Skills Package, right? We spent about 7.4 billion doing the same thing, right? Providing subsidies for jobs, for traineeships, training, retraining, for example, right? Sorry, I think there's a typo here. It's full-time reskilling, I think. Yeah, not reselling. So anyway, this is how Singapore's forward-looking approach at solving problems, right, really shines through. Right? So unlike your traditional moderation of demand only, right? When demand is too high, we bring it down. When demand is too low, we bring it up. Because Singapore's unique nature of our economy being very small and open, we cannot manage the demand side really well. So we decide to play on the supply side and use a short-run supply-side stabilisation policy. But on top of that, right, Singapore really goes beyond, right, and focuses on how do we prepare ourselves for the recovery, right, rather than just tide over the tough time and hope for the best, right? So in conclusion, right, one important takeaway is that none of this would have been possible had we not have had a strong fiscal position that was made possible by the vast amount of national reserves that have been accumulated over the past 60 years. So each time the government had to draw down upon these reserves, right, we will have to, top it up somehow, right? So in the 2009 global financial crisis, we had taken out, I think, a couple of billion dollars, right? And we managed to put it back in about 2 or 3 years. This time during COVID, right, according to the government data, we had taken out over $57 billion from our reserves. And our current Prime Minister, Lawrence Wong, already said that it's not realistic for the government of the day, right, to be able to put back this money in a short time. So then it's going to be over time, we're going to rebuild this slowly so that, and we have to rebuild our reserves slowly, right? So that future generations of Singaporeans, long after us, hopefully, if they face an economic crisis, right, they will be in a financially sound position, or the government of the day at least, right, should be in a financially sound position to be able to implement policies to solve problems. Right, so anyway, this will be the end of the session for today. And again, once again, I'm sorry for the failed live stream because of the data. My computer is lagging somehow when I'm doing live. So, well, then until next week, hopefully my computer works well next week then. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you very much.